just bring in Josh. Josh Dixon is a colleague of mine at Oxford Brookes. Hopefully you'll have all read some of his background on the registration link. But what I'll just ask you to do, Josh, if that's okay, is if you could just introduce yourself, talk about what you currently do and how you got into this role.
Yeah, thanks for having me on. So currently, I'm a lecturer in sport and exercise science at Oxford Brookes. Been doing that for the last few years now. And then alongside that, there's some consultancy work that I do. And then I've been working as a consultant within the sport and exercise science field for a number of years now. And I guess you can attest this as well, Paul. Sometimes it's a little bit hand to mouth at times, and you're wandering around trying to find jobs and picking up little bits at a time. So I've had experience within the school sector, education. So I've worked in a few state and private schools, kind of supporting their sports teams, and also kind of dabbling in some coaching early on in my career. I've consulted for some sports management companies as well. So traditional kind of off-season conditioning, getting players and athletes back up to fitness, if you like, ready for their season, and then some rehab bits on top of that, in numerous different sports, but not out of choice so much as just opportunity. Quite a lot of my work has been in football. But then I've also done things in contemporary dance and been lucky enough to work with a range of different athletes, which I think is really important, just to kind of get a different experience and work with different people, which I always find quite interesting. And even from a male-female point of view, there's different challenges within each of those kind of populations, which is always an interesting
almost
challenge.
Preempted the first question there, but I'll let you continue. So sort of how you got into your current positions.
Yeah, so I consult for the English FA, and I've been doing that for 5 or so years. And before that, I've worked for an initiative called the Nike Academy, which is a football based program where we're trying to get footballers that had been released from professional clubs back into clubs, essentially. During that time, I wish I'd been an agent, to be honest with you, Paul, because some of the fees that they would have picked up, because they were unsigned players, they went for nothing. Yeah. And then
it's a lot of money floating around there then, those types of players.
Indeed. So yeah, worked for Nike for a number of years as based at St George's Park, and then before that, as I said, within schools. But then actually, when I graduated, and this is an interesting one for me, of people's pathway into sports science and S&C as a career, I actually did a gap year because I didn't know what I wanted to do. Initially, wanted to be a physiotherapist. Didn't get the grades, wasn't smart enough to be a physio. So I ended up taking a gap year, kind of reassessing what I wanted to do with my life. Was interested in sport enough to kind of want to apply to go to university to study something related. And sports science kind of opened up a couple of interesting doors for me in that respect. So I could go and study biology, which I was good at school, and apply that in a different setting, so in a sports setting. But when I graduated, I actually went and worked as a recruiting agent in a recruitment firm in London, because I couldn't get a job. Essentially, I just graduated, and it was done a little bit of work experience, but it was there weren't many jobs available, and they all wanted more experience, obviously. So I ended up working as a recruiter in London, and got my fill of a kind of 9-to-5 traditional commuting into work every day kind of job. I knew I didn't want to do that, and then luckily managed to do some other work experience that then led to permanent work, and then started consulting and got some opportunities to work with some athletes then, and by word of mouth and just working really hard, managed to progress that, and then did a master's and doing a professional doctorate at John Moores at the moment. So that's it in a nutshell. Always find it hard to talk about myself. I don't know about you.
Yeah, it's always difficult because if you elaborate, then you can sort of end up giving yours both. But I think that was that was enough detail, and probably quite encouraging for quite a few students that are on this webinar today, because sometimes, particularly we see this with younger students, is that maybe they think you kind of just get one big break and then you're in. But I mean, that might happen to some people. They might have an intern and then be at a club for a long time. But in most cases, in my experience, a lot of the practitioners that I speak with have a similar background to you, in that it's kind of different experiences, a gradual process alongside education, and also some real world experiences as well. And I completely agree. I think that's really helpful to have that, and not just kind of go into straight one sport and stay in that sport. I think that sort of more holistic approach kind of builds your, not only your sort of professional skills, but personal skills as well. So I'm sure that you learned a lot from that sort of 9 to 5, and particularly working in recruitment, which is pretty competitive, which you're probably using now as well with your sort of teaching and coaching.
Yeah, that was a bit of a litmus test for me, and I enjoyed the recruiting side because it was commission based, in that if you were first there and last to leave, if you worked hard and were efficient, so you could have your your lunch at your desk and things like that, and you got more out of it. So it kind of made sense to me that if you worked really hard, then you got what you deserved from it. So I was quite good at that. I mean, to be honest, it wasn't particularly difficult work. It was just getting your head down and doing it. So that kind of competitive side was useful for me, because I knew if I just got my head down, I could make some progress. I worked in a county council work experience when I was in sixth form, and doing a temp agency stuff, and that was similar. It was just everyone around me was a lot older, and actually they just didn't work as hard. And I think that's kind of teaches you that kind of perseverance in a way, in a real world setting. That if you just work really hard, I'm not particularly smart, so working hard actually opened up doors, because people were like, oh, he's keen and wants to get involved, which was maybe good to have around, because I just got everything done.
Yeah, no, actually, that you've answered someone's question there, which was I can't remember it exactly, but it's towards the end of the questions. Someone said, sort of, what made you kind of stand out and get these positions? And I think what you're saying there is a combination of, well, ability for sure, but also solid work ethic, and that's essential, particularly in a really competitive industry like ours, isn't it? Where you kind of you've got to apply yourself, and it's not just sort of mindless work and just sticking around long enough, but actually sort of seeking out opportunities, finding sort of your niche, etc.
No, yeah, that's a really good question, actually. I mean, say mindless work, filling up water bottles and sourcing ice from different parts of the world is quite a large portion of my job at times on international camps. But there's a skill to it, I would say, and I'll argue that I'm probably one of the best coolers of drinks there is going. There's levels to it, mate. There's techniques to it. So, but there's the hard graft stuff, but then there's also, I think when I look back about people that I've really enjoyed working with and that I wanted to have around me while I was doing the work, it was people that were easygoing enough that you can hang out with them for a long period of time. Because I mean, you'll know, it's working in professional sport or just recreational sport, and sport science and exercise science it's long. So the people you're working with, if you get on with them or respect them and what they do, but also they're a good person. I think one of my colleagues, or our colleagues, Luke Taylor, he was say
literally just in the office, actually.
Oh, was he?
Yeah.
He goes on about it a lot, about being a good person, and I think that goes a long way as well. So fundamentally, you get to a certain level because you work really hard. But also, I think the kind of cherry on top is, or maybe even flip it, the fundamental bit is being a good person fundamentally, and being there for other people, being dependable, and working hard alongside other people in a way that's collaborative. I think that probably, when I look at people that I enjoyed working with or still enjoy working with, it's that side as well. Because you could know, there's really knowledgeable people out there, but you may not be the nicest of people. So would you want to work with them again, or would you want to work with someone that was maybe a step down intellectually or intelligence wise, where they're actually, you get on with them a bit more. So being personable and yeah, fundamentally a good traveller. So one of the physios I work with one of the England squads used to say, be a good traveller. And I think that's something that has stuck with me. So be someone that's good to have around and not a drag. Don't sap energy.
Yeah.
I think we can all think of people that do that.
Yeah, and I think we're particularly in elite sport as well, where you're with the same group for a long time, you're traveling a lot, and you're in each other's pockets, probably spending more time with those than your family in some cases. Then yeah, if you're not going to sort of have those relationships, then it's going to be very difficult and probably not enjoyable for either party. But it's really good that you've kind of started with that, because as I say, some of those questions that I received kind of on those skills, sort of how did you break through into the industry and what skills do you think are important? So you've kind of answered those without me actually having to specifically refer to them, which is really good. So I'll come on to the first one question, which you kind of alluded to previously. So you've worked with both male and female athletes. And this question comes from Tom. He says, do you write training programs differently for men and women, or are they essentially the same in terms of the percentage of time you spend working on different components such as strength, endurance, agility, etc.?
Good question, Tom. So every program should be different regardless of gender, and I think there wouldn't be a kind of cookie cutter approach to kind of a certain athlete or gender or anything, and then one for the other. It goes back to, you know, we talk about it a lot at Brooks about doing your needs analysis and gaining as much information about the person you're working with, the environment, the context, and then building up what's important and what's required. So yeah, there are differences in the way you'd program. That's one section. Gender is maybe one section of the needs analysis, but there's so many other variables that go into that there isn't just one for male and female. It's age, it's training history, it's injury history, it's things they want to work on. There's goals of the athlete, there's goals of the coaches they're working with, the key stakeholders, the organization, you know, what's a long-term plan. There are things that are maybe a little bit more intangible, and that's where you get to know the people. So what do they think is useful for them? And I talk a bit about you know, strengths and weaknesses, and sometimes that's different compared to a coach or an athlete's perspective. So finding the middle ground between that might change your program. So there are more recently now, there's some considerations with female athlete health and menstrual cycle, and I'm really excited about where that's going to go as more and more research, and specifically high quality research, comes out, because there's been a sparsity of that in the last 10 years. So hopefully more elite female participants are gonna have some research done with them, and that's kind of a more emerging side that I'm interested in finding more about. But to kind of answer the question, it massively depends, and that's one variable, but it wouldn't completely change the way I program, because there's so many other things that you take into account.
What about your coaching style of delivery? Would that, say you had a group of senior male athletes and senior female athletes, would that change at all, or is it essentially the same?
I think you would have the same approach in terms of you'd read the room. If I never worked with people before, I'd maybe a bit more conservative. If I got to know them, there's maybe little bits of banter or in jokes or things that you can start to you know, have a bit more of a normal relationship with, as opposed to being a little bit more conservative and finding out what they're like on the day. I mean, if I was making sweeping generalizations, there are maybe more questions, why are we doing this? If you were going to take the same age female and male athletes, but again, it depends on their education levels, it depends on their motivation levels on that day. Maybe more of a an involving kind of asking them for input or their feelings on where the session's going to go. Might be more of a female bias, but again, massive generalizations. It's very much dependent on the room, in my opinion, my experience.
No, I kind of preempted that might be your answer, and I know this has come up in previous webinars. Is that we're often, like, as coaches, sports scientists, and practitioners, we rarely give sort of definitive answers, which I know in some spaces can be quite frustrating. But when you think about it, particularly in a team sport, you're not working with a team, you're working with it's individuals. So it's very difficult to kind of say, you know, I did, this is my style for that group and this is my style for that group. So pretty much what you've just said, it's exactly that, reading the room and understanding what the group is like, and you know, no individual is the same.
Even from a nationality point of view, there was so working with Nike, we had, I think it was 21 different nationalities that came and went within that one squad of footballers. And if you were working with some of the Dutch players, they would want it super direct. They'd want their coaching to be, just tell me what I'm doing wrong. They want to know there and then and move on and be efficient. And again, that's a massive generalization, but the 2 or 3 Dutch players we had were very similar. And then conversely, some of the French players were a lot more relaxed, like to have a joke and a laugh during a gym session, this is, and maybe took it a little bit less seriously on the face of it, but were very determined and internally very driven. So outwardly, it would seem like the Dutch would want a more direct style, whereas if you said that the same phrase to one of the French players, they might be like, "Oh, why are you getting on my back?" So it was even little similar differences like that are apparent within the same team. It's just finding out, doing your needs analysis on the group and finding out where the room is. So it massively depends. And as you said, that's a favorite answer.
Yeah, that comes back to your kind of previous point on the introduction, is that having a lot of exposure to different groups in different settings is really useful, because then you kind of build that those interpersonal skills and ability to kind of read a group. And we talk about it a lot, and I know that some people think it's over talked about in sport about buy-in, but there are, you know, some cases where an athlete, particularly if they're a more experienced athlete, might have trained in a certain way or be used to a certain style, and it is important. And it's like in any industry, you do have to get the people to believe in what you're programming and in your philosophy. So I think that exposure that you mentioned of different groups and different styles is probably really useful particularly for young practitioners.
Yeah, absolutely. And that, I guess, a recommendation is go and try and experience that as early as possible. So I think some of my formative coaching time, I was exposed to a lot of different nationalities and levels and sports, and there are just different cultures almost. I know that word gets bandied around a lot, but going into wearing different hats almost. So you go into one environment and you maybe act a certain way because that's the way it fits, and that's the way you're going to kind of get let into the group so that you can start coaching more effectively. And then you go into another area, different athletes. So with working with loads of different sports, even within the same day, you might have to wear lots of different hats to fit in better with each one of those groups. And I don't mean change the way you are, I just mean maybe even your language. There's if you're talking to a biomechanist and you say stiff, that means something completely different to a football player when you say, "Oh, that was stiff," and they'll be like, "What? That's a negative term. They don't want to be stiff." Whereas a biomechanist, they would love things to be stiff. So the language, like, use the term Rosetta Stone. So learn how to speak their language, because you're going to get more buy-in that way. But you won't learn that if you're not part of the environment. So even shadowing and that kind of work experience is, I think, really useful. I managed to spend a bit of time in America doing some courses and doing some coaching out there, and even just the way that they spoke to athletes or set up an environment in a gym, it was really structured. Whereas if you try to do that with the people I was working with, they'd be like, "Oh, this is too fixed." And I don't like how, it goes from this, and this. I like to be a bit more free and take my time. And so all of those different ways, even from a nationality point of view, I think is really interesting to me. So we're trying to get buy-in, trying to get athletes to kind of do what we think is best, considering our needs analysis that we've done. And sometimes you have to act in a way doesn't suit your preferences and your biases, which I think is probably the most difficult things from a young coach, because I think maybe I know I did. I thought I knew the right way because I spent ages researching it, whereas actually, they did the same thing I wanted them to do. They just did it in a different way.
And I'm going to chip in with a question here, so sorry for the audience, but do you think in your experience over the last 5-10 years that the concept of buy-in is probably less important than it used to be, just because the culture, particularly in like sports like football and rugby, which where players are in academy systems, and they're kind of brought into the system where they just do certain things like the warm-ups and the S&C recovery protocols, whereas maybe before, I remember when I was starting out back in 2008-9, there were still sort of maybe not that culture of these methods, so maybe more buy-in was more important back then than it is now. But what would your thoughts be on that?
So yeah, that's an interesting question. I guess I would say, again, there are layers to buy-in. Now there's going through the motions and sitting on a foam roller and not really achieving anything, and then there's being the other end, which is like completely focused and intense and like mindful of the activity that you're doing, and trusting this is going to make change and fully investing in it. So I think maybe there's a sliding scale of people just doing it for going through the motions and then being obsessive and very intense, and there's middle grounds to that. I would say that if people truly understand why they're doing it and the purpose, it kind of slides up. But you can't maintain that level of intensity for every single section of the day. It's exhausting. So if you're doing and I get now it's more prevalent to have, on the face of it, more robust sports science kind of interventions throughout the day for every athlete and every sport. But I would question, maybe there's so much of it is the same level of intensity there for everything versus just taking all of it out and just doing one thing really, really good. So from a buy-in point of view, I guess people are doing it and doing more stuff now, and it's easier to say jump on a foam roller, whereas 10 years ago they'd be like, what the hell is that, a foam roller? Or 15 years ago. So but I question whether doing more of all that stuff at that low threshold level is actually useful, or stripping it all back and doing one thing or two things at this level is more important.
But potentially the more things that you're monitoring and doing, it could be counterproductive as well, because as you say, if you're doing things which are kind of to tick a box like foam rolling, but you're not actually doing it properly or with any conviction, same with sort of warm-up exercises, or some people call activation exercises. This has come up a few times recently. I think I read an article by, I think it was Barry Drust, about kind of over surveillance of players, and maybe it used to be that the players were kind of, they'd go and do their training and left their own devices, but now there's so many expectations of players that it could be that we've gone, or in some cases we've gone the other way and there's too much.
Yeah, I would definitely agree. I've gone, I think, almost full circle in now less is more, and that's more of the mentality for me currently, working with the people I'm working with, and trying to reduce the noise from me as a sports scientist, strength conditioning coach, and actually turning the volume up on the technical, tactical stuff, because that's the really important stuff, and I'm not trying to detract from that. So the more that I go, I want to measure whatever, then is that enhancing the volume of the sport, or detracting from it and making it more about what I think is important, which might not be aligned with the coach You know, the people that run the organization, the players, the athletes, all that kind of, my other colleagues, the people in the NDT, the doctor, physio, all that kind of thing. Does that, does the thing that I'm doing and monitoring help that whole collective vision of going forward and being successful, or is it just going to put a number on a spreadsheet for me that I'm not going to do anything about anyway, and that no one cares about?
This, on that point, this is a really nice segue into some of the more sort of specific technical questions that have come in. So Byron has asked, do you use GPS data from games to design your training sessions? If so, what GPS metrics do you focus on?
The short answer is yes. And I'm not going to blow anyone's mind with the things that we're looking at. If you search and do a literature search, we're using the same metrics as everybody else. I think there are maybe some interesting developments. I'm not the one to talk about that. I'm not an expert in GPS. I would kind of look to some more of the prominent speakers within that, and also the companies that are providing the technology, and tap them up for maybe developments. But we would use, in our needs analysis, use metrics from matches that would maybe then inform certain volumes and intensities within training. Now, what I've maybe done in the past is take those numbers, if we use volume intensity metrics, and say, I'm going to design a session that either overloads that particular metric so that we're robust enough to perform that in a match. But I would do that within a separate S&C sports science drill. Now, and it has been my preference for a little while, is to integrate that within more of a footballing context. One of my colleagues, Martin Evans, and I have really tried to make that transition to being as football first as possible within the teams that we've been working with, and trying to get some of that, those outputs that we're looking at from the match in the technical drills. And there's a coach that working with, Geraint Tuzi, who's an excellent technical coach and is an absolute encyclopedia of football drills. And him and Martin would sit down and go through all these different variations of things to elicit the physical kind of outputs that we're looking at from a sports science point of view. But it has to have a technical, tactical accent, as it was based upon the Dutch system we're kind of working in. And that's the fundamental aspect, is it's got to have a football purpose, not just from a numbers point of view, because that changes. I mean, the style of play, that's what we've seen recently within international football, that style of play massively affects physical outputs with the GPS. So exploring that would be interesting in the future. And that, depending on formation, the people you're playing against, the context of the game, all of that changes. So being too reliant on those numbers, I think, can get you in a bit of hot water, because you're trying to hit things in training that maybe aren't relevant.
Yeah, I mean, you've answered my question now. I was going to ask you, obviously, this changes depending on the opposition and the style of play, but someone else has asked a question, which you sort of alluded to there, which was, this is from Greg. How much, if any, influence does the head coach have when it comes to the strength and conditioning program? Does this vary depending on the head coach?
Yeah, massively. I mean, depending on where you're working, I mean, within football, within certain clubs, there's a hierarchy, and you would experience as well, Paul, that sometimes the head coach, the manager, the gaffer, the boss dictates everything, all the running of the club. I think that's changed a little bit now in the last 10, 15 years specifically. But if the manager, the head coach, doesn't want players to be in the gym for whatever reason, they can kind of make it very difficult for that to happen. Conversely, if they're interested in that and think that's important, yeah, then it allows you to kind of do your job, essentially. But I think, yeah, it varies a lot. Sometimes you might have to do some convincing, but I think also you might have to do some listening to what they think is important and fit within that boundary and that parameter. So there might be certain things that they've had, if they played, they might have had a bad experience with squatting or something, just, you know, pulling a random exercise out the air. So they don't want the players to squat. So are you going to sit there and argue the point, no, squatting is really beneficial, or just say, okay, I understand what you're saying. We can maybe develop the physical qualities that we're after by doing a different exercise or changing the environment or that kind of thing. I think that's where problem solving and reading the room, and because you don't want to ruin that relationship. And also there might be a really valid reason that you don't know about why that's the case.
So similar to what you were saying before in terms of when we talked about the difference, if there are differences in your style between males and females, it's very much the same with the management. Like they might have a different philosophy on S&C. They might have come through a background or a system where it's deemed more important or less important. So I guess you're saying that your adaptability has to come through again in that case, and not, you can't be regimented. You've got to fit into their philosophy, and even if sort of if they're not fully behind it, there's ways that they can sort of dictate that you do less by changing the program around.
Yeah, absolutely. It's I actually had an experience where I could have gone and worked for a club. This is a few years ago now, but my kind of values from an S&C point of view, so my preferences of the way that I'd want to coach and how I saw benefit working with other people previously, didn't align with what the club was presenting. And so I didn't really want to go and work with them because I felt like it would be too much of a compromise for me. This was when I was a bit younger and kind of more enthusiastic maybe and keen, and less able to play the game, because you're going to have a really short career if you turn up somewhere and start having an argument with the people that are above you about what you should and shouldn't do with the athletes. I think you're going to get yourself into hot water. Conversely, I wouldn't say that you should roll over every demand, but you need to pick your battles and understand what's important from a long-term point of view, and whether you can get what you think is required. Because I mean, also be honest, say like, do you know what, I don't think I'm going to be able to get the players to perform the roles and responsibilities that you want them to without doing X, Y, and Z. And if they go, well, that's fine, then you know you kind of got your answer. If they go, okay, well maybe we can do X, then you start doing X. So yeah, it depends on the context, and it's about playing the game at times, and that doesn't mean being sneaky or underhand. It's about keeping your cards to your chest and picking your battles, and make sure that you're not just getting into arguments for the sake of it, because it won't last. Your career will not last very long.
And have you ever worked under sort of a head coach or team manager, who's giving you kind of complete free reign to do what you want to do and not really had any involvement, sort of like that's the conditioning and strength side of things, away you go?
I've had, I have had situations similar to that, and I think not that they didn't care or they weren't interested.
Yeah, sure.
But more so that there was a level of trust there, where they went, look, we've got you in for a reason. You know, I trust you with this. I built a relationship with those people, and I think that's they've got bigger fish to fry than thinking about, you know, whether people are going to do an RDL or not, or they don't want they want the players to perform on the pitch or in the court or whatever, the arena, and they want them to be available for selection. So if they're available and they're able to do the jobs that they're being asked, and you've demonstrated you're dependable and reliable, that kind of thing, then I think you do earn the right to kind of do things you want to do. I've had a lot of freedom early on in my career, and I really appreciated that. And I learned a lot through trial and error, and had a lot of resources as well, and made a lot of mistakes. that I look back on and be like, I would do it differently. So I've refined that. So that's been really lucky for me. And that's down to head coaches and people above me that have trusted me enough to let me do it. So that's not always the case, though. And I guess you probably have experiences of the opposite way. And that's a more difficult one. And maybe you can't, you have to play the slow game.
Yeah, sure. I'm going to move on to some questions from Vili, who's asked several questions, but I'm not going to be able to get through all of these. But I'll prioritize the ones which I think are kind of most interesting. So how do you decide how much S&C to do with international players so that they're not undertrained or overtrained when returning to their clubs from an international break?
Yeah, good question. A lot of that is dependent on what they're used to. So we're dealing with anybody that you've only got for a short amount of time. You have that time point within their season, their career, whatever. There's a massive chunk of information, training, context that comes before that. So a lot of it is based upon what they're already used to. So if, for example, any athlete would come into a situation and you would say, eccentric hamstring strength is really important for this event or whatever, and you go, I'm just going to pick a Nordic. You wouldn't do a high volume eccentric exercise with somebody that's never done it before. So to put simply, a lot of what we would do, or what anybody in their right mind would do, would be not to kind of do too much, or even indeed too little compared to what they've already done. Because in international windows, they're not very long, there isn't a massive amount of time to really do anything anyway because of the fixtures. So you're preparing people to play based upon the parameters of volume, intensity levels that they had previously, with their injury history, with the way that with the equipment you've got available. You might be traveling, so you don't have the same gym facilities or pitches or training environments. There might be time delays, time zone changes, all that kind of stuff. So we're relatively conservative within that if you've got anyone for a short amount of time, you're not going to try and just ramp up massive amounts of volume intensity in anything. We're trying to give them back in the same way, if not a little bit better than what they came into.
So presumably that involves some liaison with the clubs as well, in terms of what the players have been doing going into that training camp. Yeah,
absolutely, and also from the players themselves. So quite often they have, they've gone through it. Not quite often, they've always gone through it. They know what they've done, and so speaking with them is really important. And it's also important, especially during in the age group camps. Being away on international duty is a stressful, emotional, exciting time that's different than just being at club. So when they come away, quite often there's some anxiety, maybe there's some homesickness, there's different environments, there's a high level of play. So they're all international athletes. They're all training with each other, whereas at club level, you might have a handful, you might have 10 international players, but within a squad of 30. So when they all come together, training intensity naturally rises. There's competitiveness that's extra. There's all these contextual, emotional factors that build up on that. So if you're then trying to add some physical loading on top of that they're not used to, it's a recipe for.
It's not going to end well.
No. So
I'll just come in on there because a question that has come in from Callum is on that theme of having a short period of time with players. And so he asks, when you have players for 1 or 2 qualifying games or friendly games, is your focus purely on preparing the players for the match, or is the program also geared towards the next tournament?
Both. There's a long there's a long-term goal that that you can't affect within that camp from a physical point of view, but maybe from an education, from a skill-based thing. So, for example, if you're going to travel to a certain area where you don't have gym access, you might in the previous camps introduce something that piece of equipment that you can travel with, or a technique that you're going to get the things that they need to get done from a physical point of view in that other environment. So you try not to expose people to completely new things all the time. So there might be some layering of information or technical bits, so that when you're at the pointy end in the tournament, nothing's new and you've built it up over time. So there's a fine balance between kind of doing as much as possible within that window versus drip feeding everything in, keeping it simple, so that when they come back, they've actually remembered it and retained it, as opposed to being bombarded with information. They go back, they come back on camp, and then they're like, I didn't remember any of that stuff because I was getting told technical things, tactical things about my psychology, nutrition, things going on at home. There's so many other things going on that keeping it simple is
I'm guessing that must be one of the real challenges about working in international camps, is avoiding the temptation, as you say, they're not to try and do too much, because you've got that concentrated block, and actually, as you say, keeping it simple and not overwhelming players, because they're coming in from different backgrounds, and also they've got the technical demands as well. And if you're traveling to a different climate, you've got all of these factors. So that must be quite one of the most challenging aspects, I would imagine, of working with players for a short window, is not overcooking them and doing too much.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it trickles down from the top position, so the head coach and everybody else. And I think when you have people that get it, it makes it so much easier. But there's also adapting when you're there, because things that you've planned for that you think, oh no, this is going to be an easy day, end up being, really tiring or maybe easier than you thought it was going to be. So you have to flex and adapt and, be fluid and agile and all those words when you're away, and constantly change the plan based upon what you're seeing. So, you're adapting based upon the feedback. So there's that side of it. But I'm just reflecting on like the age group stuff as well, that they have even less time, and they've got educational requirements as well on camp. So there's a lot going on, and like I said, when it's their first ever time away, I mean, we had people at the Nike Academy where they turned up and didn't speak the language. There was a Russian player, Maxim, and he didn't speak a word of English, and he came over, and I was doing a one-on-one session with him to get some data and also just to kind of, introduce him to everybody and walk him around the facility, and did not speak a word of English. So I'm walking around with a Google Translate, talking into that, and he's kind of like, I haven't got a clue what's going on. So to do anything, we tried to upskill him so that he could play in that week, but actually he was a fish out of water, didn't have a clue what was going on. So trying to get any quality of work through him, it was also irrelevant. Like, he was a young lad that's completely changed country in a massively different culture, different food, and not had anybody. Needed somebody with him to kind of to go through it all and be with him as a person, not as an S&C coach. But luckily, the team there we had, the staff were incredible, and we hope we made everyone feel really welcome, and we're still in touch with a lot of players there. And it was definitely a family feel. I mean, we lived with each other 6 days a week as staff, but also as players. They lived there on site in a hotel in Stoke. I was there for 3 years all together in this one environment. So talking about being a good traveller and stuff like that, you were literally on top of each other. So we ended up being super close. So all that kind of sports science stuff goes out the window. In the early hours of the morning when people are struggling with family stuff at home, it changes the game a bit. So sorry, I went off on a bit of a ramble.
No, I know. That's completely fine. I was just reflecting on a similar thing. I've seen quite a few drivers when they come onto the scene in Formula One are very young, and they're doing so much travel, and you kind of see the elite end, when they're out on the circuit, but then you forget how young they are, and they kind of you see them turn up to training without like their trainers and things like that. And it's like these little things that you just think wouldn't go on in the background, but yeah, you kind of forget that they're not just athletes, they're people, and everyone's different, and you've got to adapt to that.
Yeah, absolutely.
I've got a few live questions have come in, which is good to see. Some of them I don't think you're going to be able to answer quickly, but we'll give it a go if
I'll
that's
do my
okay.
best.
Yeah. How do you keep elite players challenged without pushing them too far? And that comes from Shane.
Shane, I got a kind of question back, I guess. Like, what do you mean push them too far physically or mentally, emotionally? Is that
Shane, if you retype your answer or type the answer to that, and then we might come back to that one, because yeah, it's quite an open question. I'll go on to another one. This is from someone anonymous attendee. Which tools are you using for programming training on the football field? Using any particular apps or some particular software?
So I love Excel, and I'd recommend anyone aspiring sports science S&C coaches to go out and do lots of Excel stuff. It makes your life easier, and also allows you to kind of collect, present, and store things, and share things as well. And you can use some really cool stuff on Excel. Now, there are a lot of companies out there that have athlete monitoring systems, and you can look them up and for yourself. I think the best ones I've ever used are ones that are really, really simple, which is where I kind of go back to Excel. Simple not only for you to program, but also for the athlete to kind of consume the information. Mm-hmm. I think some of them are a bit too finicky almost, and required. So a lot of the players might have their phone and they can look through the program or iPad or something like that. If you're clicking through too many things, I think that's a pain in itself. Whereas if you just got a piece of paper, I'm not adverse to an old school bit of paper as well. It just keeps things simple. So anything that keeps it simple, there are so many different ones out there, and I think you need to go and experience your own ones, because things that work for you might not work for me. I would default to something that's simple for me to edit, and also simple for them to kind of consume the information and kind of get it done in a one pager, as opposed to having their whole program there, or the whole periodized plan or macrocycle or whatever. And then also easy for them to kind of take around with them as well. So
I think that's probably the nice thing about Excel, isn't it? Is that you can add to it, edit it, and you control of the inputs and what's going on, and you can modify it over time. I see what's become quite popular in sports science is programming and using programs like coding using R and Python and things. And I think that's a really useful and important skill to learn. But I was asked about this the other day from a student. I think if you've got the time to invest in that while you're a student, that's really worth doing. But when you're kind of working in the field, I suppose it does become a lot more difficult, because you're going to have to invest a lot of your time learning that skill set and that platform. So I think, yeah, probably what you're comfortable with and what you've got experience using is a good option.
Yeah, something that you get on with. Like it's all well and good learning R and also all the coding platforms, that if you feel like that's your niche maybe and you're interested in it, then that's great, because there's a need for that. If you're more Excel, or you want to use a ready-made one because you want to focus more on your coaching or the practical side, then I guess that's great as well. I don't know if you can do everything.
Yeah, that would be my take as well. I think if you're going to get good at coding, I mean, something has to give there in terms of that time investment that you're going to put into that. Whether that's your practical coaching or more CPD, it's worth doing, but you've got to ask yourself, have I got the time to do this? Because I don't think from my experience, having been on a recent course where we did a workshop on it, it's not the kind of thing you can learn in a couple of evenings.
No, unless you're predisposed to that kind of, headspace. I think some people just naturally take to it. I'm not one. It took me. I did a little bit in for my masters, and I got lost in the sauce a little bit there. But yeah, to the detriment of other things. And I think you can't. I mean, that kind of thing we were talking about at the start about perseverance and hard work and that kind of thing. I guess as I've got a little bit older, my perspective and lens has changed a bit now, where my personal life and my social life should be a big part of my life. And I guess the working really hard and being good at things and learning skills. If you try and do everything within sports science, S&C, you're not that bucket of personal social is going to get smaller. So I've tried to enlarge that as much as I can now, so that the balance is a little bit more there, and that work-life balance. But I mean, some people just love it. That might be their, Python might be their social stuff, and they might like going on forums and geeking out on that, and more power to you.
That's probably why it's become a position in itself in a lot of rugby, football clubs, cricket, is the performance analysis, and people that are actually, that's their role, is putting all that data together and processing it. Because as you say, it's very difficult to do everything, particularly if you get good at coding and that type of thing. Shane's come back. His question was about keeping elite players physically challenged without pushing them too hard.
Yeah, it's a good question. From a physical point of view, I think you have to have a really good relationship with the people you're working with to get feedback. It depends on the level that they're at from a training history point of view. If they're elite, in theory, they would have quite a good training age. I guess it also comes back to your monitoring that you're doing. So if you have really good baselines and you're monitoring regularly, and you're happy with the quality of the data you're collecting, you can make inferences on changes within that data and the monitoring that you're doing. But I would go back to the kind of conversation with the athlete, and also because they can give a direct feedback on how they're doing, but also you maybe have a better understanding of what's coming up. So taking on the cues from them about how they're feeling. There's a million ways that you can monitor people within gym settings, pitch settings, wellness type stuff. There's so many things you can do. I think it's probably drilling down to something that you think is quality and consistent enough for you to monitor, and then picking that and really investing in that to see changes over time, and seeing whether that does change, then you make tweaks. But that's not going to happen without you still being questioning them, and when I say questioning, I mean having a conversation with them about how things are going, because there's a cusp. And sometimes, I mean, injury is just, it's so multifactorial and there's so many different variables, it's impossible to know when things are going to go bad. But there's certain markers and certain life events and things in the literature, injury history and training load and that kind of thing, that you can start to kind of make an educated guess and then just ease off. It completely depends on the sport as well. If you're working with people that, like rowers for example, they just smash themselves up every single day anyway. So your monitoring is going to have to be different for them than it is for a footballer, for example. So,
and it's interesting you say that, because rowing is a sport I've worked in, and you're completely right. The at the top level, the program is brutal, particularly like at the Olympic level. And you're right, when it comes to monitoring, particularly in sports like football and rugby, there's so many things that you can monitor. But one thing that I suppose is really important is the kind of non-quantifiable stuff as well. So all of those metrics, like if you're using sort of velocity-based training, doing jumps, taking even like subjective scales, but with numbers. But there is other stuff that may not be captured, which actually could be predictive of injury risk. So for example, it could be that you might not be monitoring someone's sleep, but they might not have slept well for a while, or their diet might have been not so good for a few days, and that wouldn't necessarily be captured. But just having a conversation with the athlete, you might kind of have that broader picture, if you like.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, nobody's wellness scores goes down on a match day or on competition day because they want to perform. That's the reason why they're there. So from a fundamental point of view, getting to know the person so that they can be honest with you and open up to you and say, look, Josh, do you know what? I'm actually struggling today, regardless of any other metric that you're going to do. Because even some of the objective stuff that if you're doing jump measurements, doing that regularly, it's hard to motivate people every single day, even if in their head they're motivated. At the Nike Academy, we had players there that they would do anything. We did all sorts of different monitoring there, crazy stuff that you wouldn't be able to do in any other environment because they were so invested in making it that we had HRV measurements every day for months and months on end because they were there 7 days a week. We lived with them. We knew exactly everything they ate, every single meal. There's all these kind of crazy environmental things because we lived with them and we had the backing and funding. Now, none of that predicted injury. And the best way that we got an insight into how a player was over breakfast in the morning or on the bus on the way back from training in the evening. And those little like, you know what? Yeah, I don't feel right at the moment. We're okay, well, let's investigate that a little bit more and ask more questions. And then you go like, let's just, maybe have the morning off or see. And then that kind of thing, you never know with injury whether you've made the change for the better or the worse because you can't go back and do a double-blind controlled study. But I think that relationship thing is the crux of it for me. So building that relationship with them is more important than all the measurements.
And also not having too many measurements similar before, like when we were talking about having too many things and then you end up sort of diluting all of them to get through them. And then the metrics don't really mean anything because the noise is so great that you can't pick out the signal. I suppose that's the challenge for younger kind of sports scientists coming through now, is that the options is only going to get more, in terms of tech and wearable tech monitors. And then it's actually picking out what has a good signal and what's reliable and also what's practical as well to use when you're working with athletes. But that's a challenge for people. So it's exciting. We've got the tech there, but doesn't necessarily make life easier.
No, there's definitely more choice. And I guess looking back 10 or so years, that literature now, it's exploded. There's so many people doing research within elite environments and applied environments that you kind of get an inkling into whether something might be useful or not. But it seems like everything could be useful within a certain context. So trying it within your own space is the key, and seeing whether it fits and not. And also from a budget, from a validity, from a reliability point of view, you've got to do it yourself. So I would read around, pick one or two that you might be interested in, speak to other people you respect, and then go, right, well, let's try this and see what happens. And like you said, hang your hat on one thing that you can be really assured about.
I think what you just said there as well, I think doing that literally, trying it on yourself, can be quite important as well at times. I say this to students that are doing dissertations and research, is that you should try the protocol you're asking other people to do, because stuff on paper often looks really easy. Like some of the muscle damage protocols, for example, or even recovery protocols, sticking someone in an ice bath. But having tried it and you develop that empathy and see what it's like, I think personally that's quite important as well.
100%. Yeah, that's a really, really good point, actually, Paul. Definitely, you've got to walk the walk as well as talk the talk. I think for me, I'm not training as much as I used to, and I'm a little bit older. So that's getting more painful as time goes on, and more costly for me. But yeah, absolutely, you've got to be able to experience it. That empathy also builds relationships. So trying your best to, if you're working with people that are, 100-meter sprinters or long jumper, or things that footballers that have technical levels way above yours, you're never going to experience what they truly feel. But having that sort of shared experience of you've at least attempted something
Yeah.
that they're going to do, I definitely think builds that buy-in, that kudos as well.
Yeah. We've actually gone over the hour mark. So yeah, thanks very much for your time, Josh. There's a few questions that have come in, but I'll just ask you one of the probably quickest one to answer, if that's okay, just to conclude. So what books would you recommend, either S&C or sports science?
Oh, there are too many to recommend, I guess. One of the ones I was having a conversation with a student the other day was Dale Carnegie, How to Win Friends and Influence People. And
The classic.
it is a classic, but I think for me, the fundamental message in that was kind of be humble, be a good person. And I like that, because it often I get lost in my head around too much data side and being a bit like, this is the best way to go about it. And I used to get really one-track minded with that, but I'm trying to be more personable and listen more. And Dale has a lot of really solid recommendations that when you read it, you're like, oh, this is really common sense. But when it's stressful, when you're in the thick of competition and things are going on and things aren't going away and there's problems, quite often that whole being a good person thing might get pushed to the wayside because you need to get something done. But being aware of the bigger picture, I think, is important. So yeah, he's got some solid lessons in there for everyone maybe to review as well.
So that's a really interesting recommendation, because I think probably the questioner was probably thinking of more sort of like sports science or book like Super Training or something like that. But your recommendation kind of goes back to your intro about kind of what you've learned and more the personal side of things and learning to kind of be around people and adapt your style. So that's a nice recommendation. And I think with that, Josh, looking at the time, we'll call it a day and conclude there. There's a few questions that have come in live. Perhaps if it's okay, I can email these to you and then I can send those to the people that have asked, if that's cool.
Yeah, sure.
Excellent. Okay, so thanks very much for your time, Josh. Really appreciate it. I hope everyone's enjoyed it and found it useful. I'm sure you have. And we'll see you at the next webinar. Thanks again.
Cheers, Paul.
All right. Cheers, Josh. Bye. Bye, everyone.